Crime in Court. This is the Delphi trial transcript read through. We are on the state's case, part 31. Stacy Bozinovski, who is a forensic scientist for the state of Indiana, has been on the stand. We just finished her direct, so we are about to go into her cross. As you can tell, today I am going cameraless only because I'm really hurting and it's just not fun to be sitting up right now. So no camera for me. All right, so let us get started. Please hit the like button. We're going to continue on with Stacy Bozinovski's testimony, and we're going to begin with cross-examination. Ms. Auger is going to be doing the questioning for the defense. And I forgot to mention this will be the last video of Stacy. Following her, we're going to be going into Patrick Cicero, who is like a blood stain pattern analyst. So just so you know, this is the last episode of Stacy because I said I didn't know if it was going to be one or two. So anyhow, let us continue on. So cross-examination of Ms. Bozinovski. Ms. Bozinovski, you referenced at the end of your examination by Mr. Luttrell that there's some new emerging technologies and advancements in DNA. Yes, DNA field is ever advancing, so there's always something new on the horizon. Well, what are those? The new technologies that I was referencing with Mr. Luttrell was the rootless hair technologies that we're becoming more aware of in the forensic community. And that of those new technologies as it relates to hair, it's just a new extraction method that's, I guess, essentially been shown to be able to get autosomal STR DNA from the shaft of the hair instead of the root. And what is the extraction method? As far as I know, it's a proprietary method. It's being used by private companies only. It's not something that I have the direct knowledge of exactly what the extraction method is. And there have been criminal cases that have been resolved by the use of SNP DNA, right? Are criminal cases being solved by SNPs? Well, SNP or SNP analysis is typically used in the sequencing analysis. It's typically used in forensic investigative genetic genealogy. It can also be used on low and degraded samples as well. People have used, and I said SNP, but you refer to it as SNP, right? Yes, that's how I call it. Okay, and you can obtain SNP DNA from hair shafts, right? If you have an appropriate extraction method, then it's possible. And that's happened in the past in other criminal cases, right? I don't know of a case that's been specifically used on hair for SNP analysis. Okay, and you are currently in the process of validating a lab at the Indiana State Police to improve your ability to conduct SNP analysis, right? And extraction? Not validating a lab. We're validating an analytical procedure using SNP analysis so that you can increase your use of that. It is, right? It's a new tool that we can add to our technologies to potentially use on cases, yes. Okay, because SNP DNA provides accurate and reliable DNA extractions that can be used to solve crimes. It's possible. Again, it depends what we're talking about, but we do currently perform SNP analysis in our laboratory with next generation sequencing, and we do that right now only on unidentified and human remain cases. So it's not necessarily a suitable technology to be used on hair or mixture type samples. It's not within the scope of how we use that analysis, how you use it at the Indiana State Police Lab. That's correct. All right. And is that part of the reason why you're seeking to expand your ability? The expansion of the new tool, which is to be used for forensic investigative genetic genealogy, is SNP analysis to be used for genealogy. Again, it's only applicable to single source type samples that we can try to enhance those samples. So SNP analysis can't be used on a number of samples, but it can be used on hair if that sample is single source. Yes or no, can it be used on hair? Mr. Luttrell says, Your Honor, she's answering the question, and the court says, Sustained. Let her answer the question. She says, if that sample is single sourced and it meets whatever quantification threshold that we determine with our validation, then it potentially could be used. But like I mentioned, we're still validating that analytical method at this time. There are other labs that do that, right? That use SNP analysis for hair? Yes. Like I said, I don't know of what other laboratories are using that right now. There are private companies that can do that, but I can't speak of a specific case that's been used. Do you recall Mr. Baldwin and I coming to your lab this summer and speaking with you? Yes. And do you recall us discussing the use of forensic genealogy? Well, we did discuss the use of that. And in fact, you have cases resolved through forensic genealogy, correct? Yes, we have. All right, and you're in the process of bringing the technology in-house to your lab, correct? We are validating it, and if it is a successful validation, then that is a platform that could be brought into our laboratory. So that your equipment right now only looks at 200 SNP loci, right? Or I don't know if I'm saying that right, but she says our sequencing analysis that we do now for SNPs, yes, looks at approximately 200 loci for our unidentified and missing persons cases. But in order to properly use it or to expand your lab, people generally look at 10,000 plus loci, correct? The new chemistry that we are evaluating is looking at more than 10,000 SNP loci. All right. And by combining techniques originally developed for ancient DNA, people have been able to generate DNA profiles of S&P that have high levels of discrimination between individuals, correct? Can you repeat that? Sure. By combining techniques that were originally developed for ancient DNA, people have been able to generate DNA profiles from S&Ps that have high levels of discrimination between individuals. That sounds like you're referring to the type of extraction protocol that I'm mentioning that was specifically designed for ancient DNA, and it's a proprietary extraction method. I don't have knowledge of that method. Okay. Now, you kept hairs that you were not able to develop enough DNA to test, correct? If the hair was not consumed in its entirety, then yes, there is hair shaft remaining from those hairs. True or false? You kept hairs that do not have enough DNA for comparison, correct? Uh, I'm sorry, currently? Is that true or false? It's a difficult question to answer, ma'am. If I consumed that hair because it was already so small, then I do not have that hair any longer. Do you still have any? I do. Okay, how many? I know that I sent 72 hairs to the FBI, so I imagine anywhere in that ballpark. And you said you were holding on to those because there are advancements in DNA that you didn't want to risk consuming those by utilizing technologies that may or may not reveal results. Is that right? No. No. Okay. Because I didn't make that decision. It's not what I necessarily wanted to do. Again, I consulted with some companies on what options they had for testing and provided that information to my investigators. That decision was made by the investigators and it is being retained in our laboratory at this time. Any hair shafts for uh, potential any future testing. What companies did you consult? I personally didn't do the consultation. My supervisor did, and she was the case manager at the time, but we consulted with, I believe, Bodhi Technology and DNA Labs International. For what purpose? Those two companies were known to have an extraction process for rootless hair testing. And were they able to test any of the hairs that were collected from the scene? Like I mentioned, that decision was made by the investigator to not pursue that testing right now. That wasn't my question. Are they able to test the hairs that you had that were collected from the crime scene? I apologize. I thought you said, did they test the hairs? Are they able? Yes. They could test those hairs if that's the decision that was made. And the decision was made not to, correct? By law enforcement. I believe the decision was made not to at this time. At this time. But this is the time that Richard Allen's on trial, right? Is Richard Allen on trial? Yes. My God. But do you see what her point is? This is the time to test it. Like, we should have tested it before you put a man on trial for something that he may or may not have done if you have forensic evidence from the scene that wasn't tested in the original workup of the case, which was 5 years before Allen was ever even arrested. So, why was it never tested? It's very sus. And so that's evidence that is available potentially to the state by outside labs that we don't have available. The jury doesn't have available today to use in their determination. Is that correct? Again, I can't speak to what information would have been yielded, if any, from that testing. Because it wasn't done, right? The testing has not been completed. Has it been started? I think I've already answered that question. It has not been completed or started. Well, you're trying to words matter, sweetheart, when you're on the stand, especially. So when you say it hasn't been completed, that could leave an inference in the jurors' minds that we just didn't do it or we haven't finished it yet, but it's in the process. So I'm glad she clarified and said, well, has it been started? Okay, all right. Now, you said you sent 72 hairs to the FBI lab, correct? Yes, ma'am. All right. And they sent you one report back dated May 20th, 2020. Is that correct? That's correct. They identified 36 items, correct? It looks like there's 36 items on their list. Thank you. And they also told you that if microscopic hair comparisons are requested, please submit known head samples from any subjects. Do you recall that? Top of page 3? I do recall that. Okay. And have any samples from Richard Allen been submitted to the FBI? No. I didn't mean to do all of that. I just meant to highlight that. So you haven't even submitted hair samples from your suspect who is, is he's been incarcerated for 2 years ish by the time trial starts, and or it might have been more, but anyways, so he's been incarcerated, and you've got really no hardcore evidence on him. There's no DNA that you can match of his. So wouldn't you want that to solidify your case, especially when your case is so weak that you have some bullet casing that they say it was cycled from a gun but not fired from a gun, and that makes no sense, and blah blah blah. We know how that goes. So yeah, this is just not adding up. Have any samples from anyone been submitted to the FBI? No, they have not. So you have all these different hair samples from the crime scene that haven't been tested. 70, whatever she said. She's 72, she sent to the FBI. And you haven't tested the suspect's hair. You haven't tested or sent any samples, for that matter, to the FBI to match it. Was that a deliberate choice not to send hairs from family members and friends and people like that? I don't know. Are those microscopic examinations? Correct. Objection to what those are. I don't know if she's referring back to the hair examinations by the private companies or if she's referring to some other. Clarify your question, says the court. Ms. Auger says, oh, sure, yeah. The FBI examinations, those are microscopic examinations, right? In their report, they've said in microscopic hair comparisons are requested to these hairs, please submit head hair samples. So if the FBI reached back out to this crime lab and said, if you would like us to do side by side comparisons under the microscope of any of the samples found at the scene to any hairs that you would like to submit from somebody, please submit head hair samples. And they didn't submit anything. So is that a yes? Yes. All right. And microscopically examining hair doesn't use up the hair, right? You can examine it over and over and over again, correct? I do not perform this analysis, but I believe you are correct that they would do just a comparison of the hairs. So you could submit any number of hairs and still have the original hairs that you're comparing it to for analysis for later dates, right? Yes, it sounds like it. And at the state police lab, you only conduct the tests that law enforcement requests. Is that correct? The law enforcement agency is our customer, so yes, we perform tests on their behalf. Well, do you perform tests that they do not request? If the evidence warrants it, I guess I would need a more specific example. Well, if you become aware of a test that could be conducted, do you go ahead and do it, or do you call law enforcement and say, hey, this is available? What would you like me to do? Again, it just really depends on what type of testing we're talking about, but if it's something that's like a simple as they asked me to look for blood, but I see something that may be consistent with seminal material, then I don't go to seek consultation with the investigator to test it for seminal material. What about DNA comparisons? What about? Do you ask to compare the items that you have to known samples, or do you go ahead and compare them to the known samples that you have? Well, typically, known samples are submitted for that comparison purpose. Okay, well, let's talk about item 17, all right? That is a hair recovered from Abby Williams' right hand, correct? I just want to clarify. Yes, from the right hand. And you knew pretty quickly that it was a female hair, correct? It was consistent with a female individual. And that it might be female related to Libby German. You also knew that right away, right? Yes, there was genetic consistencies that made me think that it could be a female related to Libby German. And you had DNA samples from Becky Patty, her grandmother, correct? At that time, I did not. When did you get it? I received the DNA standard from Becky Patty at the same time I received the standard from Kelsey German Siebert. When was that? That as recently or that was recently. I'd have to refer to my chain of custody. I believe it was, I would hate to misspeak, but it was recently. About 2 weeks ago? Yes, somewhere around there. All right. So as of March 7th, you had a hair from March 7th, 2017, you had a hair that you identified as unknown female 1 that might be a female relative of Libby German's, and no one asked you to compare it to Becky Patty or Kelsey German until 7.5 years later, after the trial started. Is that right? Essentially, yes. My examination was mostly focused, like I've explained, on looking for male DNA. Why? There was indication that our perpetrator was a male individual, and that's what I was focused on, finding samples in which a male profile could be determined. You had unknown female 1, which might be related. You also had unknown female 3, right? There was another unknown female number 3 on a different team, or a different item, sorry. A different item. Right. And you had the hair from the sheet of the body bag in which Libby German's body was sent to the for autopsy. Is that right? Item 35C. I do believe that there I do believe that's where the unknown female number 3 profile was coming from, was a sheet from the body. Thank you. If I could refer to my notes through though, just to confirm. Yes, ma'am, she says. Okay. So 35C was hair from the sheet in Libby German's body bag, correct? That's correct. And that was a female hair? It was consistent with the female profile. Thank you. I always like to make that next leap. Consistent with a female profile. And so we have unknown female 1 and unknown female 3, which is item 35C, right? It was 35B, 3, I believe. Unknown female number 3 was from item 35B3. Thank you. So the only DNA profiles you have from items that came from the crime scene were unknown female 1, unknown female 3, and male DNA that you believe is from one of the lab personnel. Is that right? I think that summarized the unknowns that I developed, yes. And yet you were only looking for males. Is that right? So we have 3 unknown females, another unknown female, like, but yet unknown female number 3. So how many unknown females are there? There's at least 3. We have an unknown female 1 and an unknown female 3. Was there an unknown female 2? Are there more? Like I'm we need to know this. How many unknown females are there? And male DNA. All right, so the question was, so the only DNA profiles that you have from items that came from the crime scene were unknown female 1, unknown female 3, and male DNA that you believe is from someone in your lab. Is that right? I think that summarizes the unknowns that I developed. Yes. And yet you were only looking for males. Is that right? I can't speak on behalf of the investigators what they were looking for, but like I mentioned, I screened several of the intimate samples for the presence of male DNA, and I'm at the discretion of whatever the investigators submit for comparisons to the unknown profiles that I've developed. I don't tell them how to do their jobs. Okay, so they were telling you, hey, we're looking for male DNA. Were they telling you they were looking for male DNA? That just that was just that was just case information that I was looking, that we had a male perpetrator. Huh? So that was what you decided, or law enforcement? I followed the procedures that we have in the laboratory for screening of assay kits and intimate samples when there is a male perpetrator. Well, how do you know there was a male perpetrator? Well, ma'am, you don't know whether the perpetrator is male or female, right? I had reason to believe from the case information that I was provided. So the cops told you so. Cops told you this was a male. That's why. I had reason to believe from the case information that I was provided that it was a male perpetrator. So I screened the evidence collection kits looking for male DNA, and then the other remaining samples from clothing and swabs. That type of screening mechanism was not used. Those samples were amplified, and profiles were determined if there was enough DNA present, regardless if it was male or not. Just the intimate samples is where I was looking for male DNA. Well, and you also said you were looking for male DNA on the black sweatshirt, right? Yeah, I think that's what I just mentioned, regardless if it was. Well, I thought human or male, I was trying to find enough amplifiable DNA off of all of the evidentiary items, with the exception of the intimate samples, which include the assay kits and the body swabs. Those are the only ones that I had stopping point decisions made on whether there was male DNA or not. Okay, well, the assay kits that you examined, those had nothing relating to Richard Allen, correct? I did not develop a DNA profile from an unknown individual from any of the assay kits. And so that could lead us to believe that neither Abby or Libby was assayed, correct? I can't make those kinds of conclusions from my results. But you have no evidence that they were, right? I can only talk to the results that I have, which indicate that there were no male present DNA present on the majority of the samples within that kit, minus the external genital swabs and fingernail scrapings, which just had an insufficient amount of DNA. Now, how do you obtain DNA for comparison purposes? The contributing agency submits standards for me to use for comparison purposes. So whatever they submit, then I would compare to the unknown profiles in the case. How many standards do you think you received in this case? DNA samples. Hundreds of DNA standards. Other than Libby and Abby, their female family members and female law enforcement, how many DNA standards did you receive for females? I believe one. Out of hundreds? Oh, sorry. Yes. One, I believe, one individual was a female individual, and maybe two, but one. And multiple people could have been involved in the homicides, right? I cannot make any conclusions about what happened. That's not in the scope of my analysis. Okay. Well, it would. You looked through and you had some case information available to you, right? I only had the information provided by the investigator at the time of the submission. And that is some information about the case, right? Do you think it's information about the case? Right. All right. And you yourself testified earlier that there were many items, many swabs that contained mixtures of individuals, correct? Many of my results were mixtures. Okay. And some of those you can't limit to two people, correct? The There were a few mixtures where I was able to say at least two or at least three people, but I did not draw any conclusions from those samples. I understand, but in fact, I believe with the sweatshirt, you said three, maybe four or more, right? I made that reference in my determination of number of contributors that sometimes the information of such limited quantity that it's difficult to determine whether it's three or four individuals to give an exact number to a mixture, which means you can't limit it to three, right? Excuse me? Limit what? I don't understand the question. That was Mr. Luttrell. That was not even an objection. And Okay, but the court sustained it. He didn't even say objection, but she sustains it. Got it. Okay. And that's not a proper objection either. Which means you can't limit your analysis to three people, Libby and Abby, and only one perpetrator, correct? In the majority of my samples, I've have results that say I cannot determine the number of contributors. So it's not even that it's three, I could not determine the number of contributors. Sure, it could be three, four, five, six. I guess I would need a specific example of what you're referring to because, like I said, the majority of my results say I cannot determine the number of contributors, meaning it can be more than three, right? It could be one, it could be two, but there was not enough information for me to determine the number of contributors. I understand. Could it be more than three? Objection, that's been asked and answered twice, I think. Sustained. Ms. Auger says, I asked her if it could be more than three, and she said it could be one, it could be two, but she did not answer whether it could be more than three. The court says, you've made your point. Sustained. Move on. What? You got to get it in through the witness, and the court doesn't let her do that. But whatever. Thank you. Your lab takes extra precautions to avoid contamination. We do have procedures in place as part of our quality assurance, quality control program that help limit contamination on evidentiary items. And yet you believe that despite those precautions that the male DNA profile you developed was from one of your unnamed employees. Is that correct? Yes. There was consistencies in the male profile that I developed between them and the laboratory personnel. How many laboratory personnel have access to the sweatshirt? I was the only laboratory personnel that was examining the sweatshirt, and if that's your question, but that sweatshirt passes through the hands of several officers, investigators, and evidence clerks as it's coming in and out of the laboratory. So, can you answer that question? How many people in the lab have access to the sweatshirt? I guess I don't understand the question. The packaging of the sweatshirt or the actual sweatshirt? The actual sweatshirt, where you found the male DNA. I can't put a number on it. I was the only person to actually examine that sweatshirt, if that's the question. It was obviously collected by somebody. I believe it was transported between posts and districts into the laboratory, but I don't have an exact number. I may be able to determine that from the chain of custody, but I don't know what happens to that item outside of the laboratory and outside of my chain of custody either. Well, if you would listen to the question, that's not what she asked you at all. Sure. And I'm not asking you about outside the lab because it wasn't someone from state police whose DNA showed up on the sweatshirt, right? It was someone from your lab. Well, I am with the state police. Now you just don't want to answer the question, right? Because you're just being a smartass on purpose. Ms. Auger says, okay. The witness says, and. Well, not someone from the post, correct? The state police officers are considered part of our laboratory personnel employee database as well. So the male DNA you found on the sweatshirt could have been from a state trooper? Could it have been? Yes. If they were in our employee database, then they would have been considered, or they would be considered, yes, as part of our employee database, a laboratory personnel member if they are involved in the handling and collection of that item. Now it's not, so despite your precaution, someone from the lab, their male DNA was on the sweatshirt, so it's not unexpected that DNA can be transferred from one person to a sweatshirt, correct? It's not unexpected for DNA to be transferred between, obviously, people and the item. Okay. And especially if you're handling a sweatshirt to the point that you're dressing a body with it, right? There's a lot of interaction for someone in that sweatshirt. Would you agree? Are you asking me a hypothetical situation of if that's possible? Mr. Luttrell says there's no evidence of anyone dressing a body, Your Honor. I would object to the question. Facts, not an evidence. Sustained. If someone were dressing a body with a sweatshirt, would that be a lot of interaction that they had with the sweatshirt? It would be maybe more than just a temporary contact DNA like we were speaking of earlier, but I hesitate to say whether it'd be enough to put DNA on an item because there's a lot of factors in place, like what kind of personal protective equipment were you wearing and what was happening during a dressing event. Well, did anyone at your lab actually touch the sweatshirt outside the packaging other than you? I can only speak to what happened to that sweatshirt while it was in my custody, and no one other than myself touched it while it was in my custody. Did you take the cuttings from the sweatshirt, or did you have someone else? I did that. Was there any other testing conducted on that sweatshirt other than what you did? I'm not aware of any. If there was other testing done, I'm not aware of it. Do you have any male assistants assisting you? During my examination, no. Now, you've also reviewed and examined items that were collected from Richard Allen's home. Is that correct? Yes. There were items submitted that were indicated to me as being collected from Richard Allen's home. You examined a number of items that came from his home? Yes, ma'am. And on any of those items that you examined, did you find any connection to Abby Williams or Libby German? No. I did not find any DNA profiles from any of those items that were consistent with Abby or Libby. You examined a coat, a blue Carhartt coat. Do you have a date on that report? I believe it's November 2022. Yes, I did examine a blue Carhartt coat. And you examined a cutting from a carpeted area of Richard Allen's Ford Focus? Yes, ma'am. You examined some black boots. That's correct. Some knives. Yes, ma'am. And no evidence anywhere of DNA of Libby or Abby. That's correct. Now, earlier you testified it could be difficult to get DNA from unspent cartridges. Recall that? Yes, ma'am. And you said that was because you need an abundance of skin cells. Well, I didn't say that was because of that. There could be a number of factors, but it could include the amount of DNA that would have to be left behind on the item like that. But you don't know how many times someone touched or interacted with the unspent shell, correct? Right, which is why it's necessary to take that swabbing to attempt the DNA analysis on the sample. And you can get DNA from metal surfaces, correct? You can. When you examined the cartridge, did it appear to have been impacted in dirt at any point? I would not be able to draw that kind of conclusion from my examination of the cartridge. Like I mentioned, it had a slight dirt-like staining present on it. So there was slight dirt present, but I wouldn't know whether it was embedded or how it got there. Okay, slight dirt. Is that right? Yes, I believe that's. And despite an abundance of blood on the crime scene, there was no DNA on that casing, that cartridge from Abby or Libby, correct? There was not enough DNA on the cartridge for me to develop a DNA profile from anybody to be compared to anybody. How many hours did you spend on this case? I don't know. I can't put a number to that. As you can see, I've issued a lot of reports. I've done a lot of items. How many items do you think you examined? Hundreds of evidentiary items along with the hundreds of standards that I've looked at. Is it fair to say you put a lot of time and work and energy in this case? Yeah, I would say so. And nothing can be connected, nothing biologically, or I'm not going to be able to pronounce this, from a serological standpoint, connects Richard Allen to Libby German or Abby Williams, correct? Despite all those hours and time and energy. There were no DNA results where I have an unknown male profile or a profile that's consistent with Richard Allen from all of the examinations that I've done. Can you obtain DNA from spit? Spit is essentially saliva, so yes, it's possible that would be a good source of, or would be a source of DNA. Thank you. The court says, Mr. Luttrell. Mr. Luttrell says, yes. And we begin redirect. Mr. Luttrell says, yes. So, no DNA of profile consistent with Richard Allen or with any unknown male. Is that correct in your analysis here? That's correct. I did not develop a DNA profile of any unknown male individuals from the items that I've examined and talked about here today. So, these new ventures of DNA that Indiana State Police is entering and attempting to validate, you're a part of at least two of those initiatives, correct? That's correct. And would either one be of assistance to the jury in this case, in your view? Like I mentioned, the SNP analysis that we're currently using in our laboratory, that I am an analyst using for casework, is only being used on unidentified human remains and missing persons casework, and only for samples that are reasonable to be single source profiles, so not mixture samples. It's not a suitable technology for this type of mixture. The other method, which we're currently still validating, is something that may be used on forensic samples like hair, but that validation is still undergoing and would still warrant us having an appropriate extraction method to obtain DNA from the shaft of a hair. Speaking of hair, the FBI indicated that they did microscopic examination of hair, and they could do more, they said. And if they do, they had some instructions of how to submit it. Is that correct? There was just a reference of additional, like, microscopic hair examinations or comparisons could be performed upon submission of additional known head hair samples. And microscopic hair examination is no longer a legitimate form of identification. Objection leading. Sustained. I'll rephrase it. Is it a legitimate form of identification and comparison in identifying an individual? It's not my specialty, and this is not a type of analysis that we perform in our laboratory. So we do not do hair comparisons in our laboratory to show whether hairs are consistent with specific individuals. That is something that the FBI is comfortable doing, and I believe that they acknowledge that as just a kind of an investigative tool, not an identification method. It's a screening device? Yes. And the Indiana State Police used to have a hair comparison team or unit in the laboratory, didn't they? Objection leading. Overruled. Our laboratory did used to do those types of comparisons way before my time. I'm not familiar with that, and it's nothing that's been in place in the 18 years that I've been in the laboratory. Are you aware of whether or not microscopic hair comparison for investigative jobs that you've held and any other jobs? Sure. As an officer, wait a minute. Nope, that question did not make sense. I thought I was ready and on page one, and I was. I don't know what happened. Sorry about that. Let me restart that question. These stupid transcripts, they just break in the middle of someone's testimony, so I have to switch documents. So apologies, and I thought I was on the right page. Are you aware of whether or not microscopic hair comparison for identification has been discredited and no longer in place in the Indiana State Police? I am aware that there's been concerns about these types of hair comparisons in the forensic science community. Aside from the fact that you were doing male specific, searching for male specific information in the SA collection kit, the other examinations, were you focusing only on limiting your search to male DNA? No. Outside of the evidence collection kits and the other body swabs that were taken from Libby, I was just looking for enough DNA to amplify and develop a DNA profile. The intimate samples from Libby and the samples from the evidence collection kits I screened under laboratory protocols looking for the presence of male DNA and determining a stopping point essentially on those samples based off of how much DNA was present. All the other items that you examined, you couldn't tell the swab or the hair or the cutting whether it was male or female before you tested it, correct? Right. That type of determination is made during the quantification step, whether there's indication of male DNA and human DNA. The amount of, I guess, female DNA can kind of be inferred from a comparison of male and human DNA. Okay, whatever, that doesn't make sense. Mr. Luttrell says, just one moment, Your Honor, I think I'm about finished. Was there any resource within the Indiana State Police DNA laboratory that you believed would be helpful that you did not employ here on this in your analysis and investigation? In my review of the evidence for this case, I feel like I have exhausted a lot of the resources that we have, if not all of the resources that we have in our laboratory. There's nothing that comes to mind when I think about other disciplines that could have been or should have been considered in the evidence that I've looked at. Thank you. I have no further questions. Ms. Auger, says the court, and we have some recross. Ms. Auger asks, there are other labs with greater capabilities than yours, correct? I would hate to say greater. Each laboratory has different procedures and different processes in place for DNA analysis. But there are labs that can do things that your lab can't? Yes, ma'am. Okay. And you sent off cigarette butts for forensic genealogy, correct? Yes, I did facilitate sending off those samples. Because you didn't have the ability to do that at the Indiana State Police lab, right? That's correct. Would you agree that the idea that hairs without roots can provide mitochondrial DNA, which can be useful for genealogy purposes? Why can't I speak today? Yes, hairs without roots could be used for or could have mitochondrial DNA performed on them. I'm not sure if the mitochondrial results can be used in genetic genealogy other than maybe assigning like a maternal haplotype group, but again, I'm not a mitochondrial DNA analyst at this time. Are you aware that it can provide information on maternal lineage? Yes, ma'am. That's the maternal haplotype that I was referencing. And it can also be used to predict externally visible characteristics such as eye, hair, and skin color. That type of externally visible characteristics is not coming from mitochondrial DNA, so those types of conclusions are based off of SNP analysis or SNP markers. Okay, and you can get the SNP markers from the hair shaft. If yes, through that. Okay, thank you. Analysis. Now, you sent hair 72 or the 36 they received hairs off of the off to the FBI lab for microscopic comparison. Mr. Luttrell says, we're outside the scope of redirect, Your Honor. We've been over this. I would object. Ms. Auger says, no, he asked her about microscopic hair comparisons as well discounted. Mr. Luttrell says, I did. Ms. Auger says, yeah. The court says, and now you're talking specifics. Is that what you're doing again? Well, the court says, answer my question so I can rule on the objection. Yes, overruled. Thank you. Sorry, didn't mean to hinder the process, so I apologize. You sent 72 or 36 hairs off to the FBI for a microscopic hair comparison, correct? Yes. They didn't ask for it, you sent it and asked them to do it, right? Who didn't ask for it? The FBI didn't ask to receive the hairs, you sent them to them and asked them to test the hairs. Oh, yes, sorry, I wanted to clarify. Sure. I sent that hair on behalf of my investigators who did ask for it, so that's why I wanted to clarify. The FBI did not request those hairs. Yes. Okay. And they responded in 2020, right? The report is dated from 2020. Thank you. Nothing further. Does anybody on the jury have any questions for Ms. Baz- Bozinovski? I keep wanting to call her, uh, what's her name? Pam, what's her face? Okay, I can't think of her name, but I'm getting them all confused now. The chick from called her a chick. The prosecutor in the Menendez brothers case. Bazanich. Bazanich. Miss Pam Bazanich. And then we've got this Bozanovsky. I keep getting them confused. Um, so sorry. All right, we do have some questions. She says, does anybody on the jury have any questions? And they do. So we've got some juror questions here. So the attorneys go to a sidebar to read through them first before they read through them in front of the jurors. The court reads the first one and says, what type of quality control is necessary when testing for DNA regions? For DNA, what? Says Ms. Auger. The court says, regions. Ms. Auger says, oh, they didn't even use that word when testifying. So why are the jurors using that word? I don't know if we had regents, but she can answer, says Mr. Luttrell. The court says something, but we don't know what because it's inaudible. Ms. Auger says, yeah. Mr. Luttrell says, sure. The court says, reads the next question. Do you need to do repetitive testing to validate your results? Auger says, fine. Luttrell says, what type of testing? Repetitive, says both Auger and the court. Mr. Luttrell says, oh. The court says she testified that has presumptive and confirmatory, so not sure if that's a question. Do multiple people perform various phases of the analysis? Mr. Luttrell says, yeah, that's a good question. The court says, how do you handle chimeras? Handle what? Chimeras? What the hell are they talking about chimeras for? I don't even know what that is. The court says, I know I think I've seen the word before. Ms. Auger says, yeah. I'm not even going to explain, but okay. So the next question is, does a generational chimera weaken over generations, or can the contributor be isolated? Who is this juror, and why are they asking all these questions that have not even come into testimony here? The court even says, are we in a rabbit hole? Are we going to ask this question? I mean, that never came up in either your direct, recross, redirect. Mr. Luttrell says, I'm assuming she would know, but I'll object to it. Ms. Auger says, I mean, I think if she can answer it, she can. I don't know. But why even bring it up? Because it's confusing. And what the hell does it have to do with anything? Because you haven't talked about it in this case. So no, you should object to it. Mr. Luttrell says, I don't even know what the question's asking. Court says, I don't either. Mr. Luttrell says, no, I just don't want to ask it. Ms. Auger says, yeah. Court says, so just ask, how do you handle chimeras? Yeah. And then ask her. I'm fine with that, says Mr. Luttrell. They shouldn't even ask that because it never came up. They shouldn't even ask that. The court says, are your storage refrigerators for standards locked at all times, even if inside the locked laboratory? That was something that I thought Ms. Auger should have got into more was the chain of custody within the laboratory. How did that person, because she kept talking about the chain of custody in general, which included all of law enforcement, but she didn't talk about the chain of custody within her own lab and how that other lab personnel's DNA could have got on it. So, anyways, all right. So, next question. What what restricted access policies are in place? And it says what personnel restricted access. This says restricted access regarding personnel. Mr. Luttrell says what personnel have access? The court says can toxic drugs or inhalants alter the DNA strands? Wow, says the court. Can you read it one more time? I'm sorry, says Ms. Auger. The court says, can toxic drugs or inhalants alter the DNA strands? I think that they're getting to what they're getting at is if you put like chloroform over someone's face, can that alter the DNA? I mean, Ms. Auger says that's fine. The court says, what is PCR, an analyzer or methodology? Poly, whatever you say, chain reaction. Ms. Auger says, yeah. Court says, okay, can we just ask what is PCR? Because then she can describe. Yeah, I know what it is, says the court. Ms. Auger says, I think that would be, yeah, it would be, okay. Sidebar conference concluded. I'm surprised there's not more questions, but the questions that have been asked, I think, are all very stupid questions. And I want to know who this juror is, thinking that they're asking all these really important big words because they've heard it somewhere in DNA and it had nothing to do with the testimony at hand. So I don't think they should be asking any of these questions, in my opinion, but here we go. What types of quality control is necessary in the testing for DNA regions? DNA regions you prepare them through a series of steps that are a protocol that's followed, that's logged. The date and time of the regions being prepared is logged as well, and we adhere to expiration dates from manufacturers as well as the chemical components of our regions. So, a lot of our regions we make in house from chemicals that are brought from manufacturing companies. And then, as far as the use of regions, we do a quality control on the reagent to make sure that it's working appropriately by testing a positive and a negative control to ensure that it's giving us the expected results when doing our testing. Mr. Luttrell, I have no questions on that. Ms. Auger, no questions. Do you need to do repetitive testing to validate your results? Within the scope of a forensic case, no, there's not a need to do like a duplicative test or reproduce a test as a confirmation of any sort. I will say that as something that is considered as part of our validation studies, we'll consider, testing multiple samples to ensure we're getting, consistent results from a sample. Mr. Luttrell, he asks. And the results of those validation studies are that do you get consistent results or not? Yeah, it's very dependent. That's kind of within the scope of a sensitivity test and a validation sample, or even like a concordance test. We'll make sure that it's yielding reproducible results in that validation. If we're reaching a sensitivity level that isn't yielding reproducible results within validation, then that's kind of how we help determine our thresholds for when we can make interpretations on a sample. So, if a validation study will show you're not getting reproducible and consistent results, then that might fall outside the scope of what is something that we would incorporate into our procedures. Ms. Auger? Nothing. Nothing. All right. Your questions continue. Um, do multiple people perform various phases of the analysis? Not within our laboratory. So we have a case uh, is assigned to an analyst, and that analyst works the case all the way through for the majority of cases. Occasionally, you'll have an analyst that may only do the serological examination in a case, and so they'll do all the screening and determining what body fluids are present, and then a separate analyst may do all the DNA analysis, but for the most part, most cases in our laboratory are completed by one analyst all the way through. But she even contradicts that in her case, saying that her boss, who was the case manager in this, like this woman did most of the testing, but her boss also did testing and things and had access to the items. Mr. Luttrell, and he has some follow-up questions. So, if I understand, make sure I understand you correctly, are you saying that every exam that you talked about and the items that you examined in this case, that you were the only one who conducted all phases of the exams? In all the results that we've talked about here today, I am the only one that did those examinations. I didn't have an assistant or a technician or other analyst doing those testings. Thank you. Ms. Auger, no questions. How do you handle chimeras? I think that the question is referring to chimeras or chimera, however you say it. I think it's chimeras. And that's a good question. So, individuals that are chimeras may have a very unique DNA profile where some of their body fluids might be consistent with one profile, but perhaps another body fluid would or could have a different profile. I personally have not seen that in my analysis. So, if something like that were to arise, we definitely would have to, if that was something that we expected in a case, then that would be something that it would have to be considered. Well, if you've never seen it, how do you know? Because how would you know that that was the case? How would you even suspect that you had this kind of a case? She's never had it in her career, so how would she even know? So typically we have, excuse me, in our past request for labs form, we would have a question in our past request for labs form. So the form itself, we would have a question for, has an individual been transfused, because a transfused individual is someone who might exhibit two different DNA profiles, one from their donor and one from their own DNA. That hasn't come to mind in any case that I can think of, but in that instance, we would need to have a DNA profile from both of those kinds of body fluid sources to be able to compare back to an unknown profile. Mr. Luttrell? Thank you. I have no questions on this. Ms. Auger? No questions. But then she has a question. Oh no, the next question is this is a jury question, sorry. They didn't put the divider in there. Are your storage refrigerators for samples locked at all times, even if you are inside of a locked laboratory? She says, not necessarily. We have a personal evidence storage boxes within a freezer. If I have evidence or extractions within that personal storage box, then it is locked, but we do consider our laboratory secure once the laboratory space is secure. So we don't, that makes, okay. So we don't always need to lock those personal evidence storage just for the refrigerator. My personal dry storage is always locked. Mr. Luttrell? Nothing. Ms. Auger? No. What restricted access policies are in place with personnel? So the our laboratory is structured in a way that you have to badge to get into the laboratory. So that's monitored. Only certain individuals can get into the laboratory area itself, so only biology analysts can access that area. No one outside can get into the laboratory areas, or even individuals from other units can't access our laboratory without being escorted into our unit. As far as the overall laboratory, contributors can come into just a couple of entry points into the laboratory. If they want to get beyond those guest areas, then they are escorted at all times and don't have access to the overall laboratory as well. Mr. Luttrell, I have no questions. Ms. Auger, no questions. Can toxic drugs or inhalants alter the DNA strands? I'm not really sure. I think that the effects of drugs could affect like maybe like the morphology of cells. I've seen that where I believe like a sperm cell could be affected by the type of drug used, but I can't say whether it would affect. I don't believe obviously we all have cellular material in our body, but it shouldn't affect whether there's DNA that can be left behind by someone who might have had toxic exposure to a drug. Mr. Luttrell? No questions. Ms. Auger? No questions. And what is PCR? PCR standards for polymerase chain reaction. I know I didn't say that right. And that's the method that we use during amplification to make millions of copies of DNA. So I know I mentioned 25 to 50 cells that need to be left behind in a sample. In order to actually visualize that little bit of cellular material, I need to amplify it, and PCR is that process in which I can make millions of copies of it. Mr. Luttrell? And when you make those copies, are you changing the DNA? Essentially, no. If there's a sufficient amount of DNA present, then it's making copies of the DNA that's present. It's when you get into like a low template quantity where there's just a little bit of tiny bit of DNA, then your amplification process could cause some effects that I'd hesitate to say change it, but may give you some effects that aren't necessarily accurate. Thank you. Ms. Auger, says the court. No. All right, thank you, Ms. Bozinovski. You may step down. The witness says thank you. The court says you may call your next witness, and that is going to be Pat Cicero, who is the blood stain pattern analyst guy. He's like a crime scene investigator, and he's familiar with blood stain patterns. So we will get to that in tomorrow's episode. So thank you guys for watching, and I will see you guys in the next episode. Take care. Bye now.